Thank you everybody for joining this webinar. It would be great to see you all in person. Unfortunately, we can't do that at the moment, but hopefully at the next conference, we'll be able to all be in the same room. So the footwear supply chain and the footwear industry is going through a period of a lot of disruption at the moment, as are a lot of sectors in the supply chain. The turbulence that we've seen, particularly so far this year around COVID, has impacted supply and also demand. So it's had a pretty wide-ranging impact. This disruption is accelerating some of the new technologies. It's accelerating different sales channels. It's presenting a lot of challenges for brands, but also a lot of opportunities as well for brands that are able to grab those opportunities. This is also an opportunity for brands to take a closer look at their supply chain and identify areas of weakness, identify areas of opportunity where there's the opportunity to strengthen the supply chain for the future. So what I'd like to talk about today is a few of the key areas, the key ingredients that we see in the successful supply chains of the future. And that is mainly, number one is flexibility, two is speed, and then three is resilience. But before diving into those individually, let's just have a kind of set the scene on how disruption typically impacts the supply chain. So if we look at the COVID situation, the impact has been across all elements of the supply chain. So on the supply and production side, there's been weeks and in some cases months of production, either stoppages early on in China when COVID hit, but there's also been impacts on production from cancelled orders. Not all brands have cancelled orders, but some brands have found themselves in that situation. Those cancelled orders have had, of course, a knock-on effect on the factories, the suppliers, with having to lay off workers in some cases and reduce staff hours. A lot of those cancelled orders or reduced orders, they're not coming back. That's revenue for brands which is gone. It's revenue for the factories that's gone. So really now it's about focusing on the future, and it's good to see that a lot of the production is restarting as consumer demand picks back up. What we've also seen as a result of some of this is that there's more interest from brands now on the upstream supply chain, so the raw material supply chain, because in the past that's been somewhat of a black hole for many brands. I'll talk a bit more about that in the coming slides. Another area of the disruption on the supply chain is on the demand side. So footwear retailers, bricks and mortar footwear retailers, have been amongst the hardest hit during COVID. Stores have been closed. Consumers have not been able to go to the shops to buy footwear in many cases. Those brands which already had a good e-commerce capability have been able to weather that storm a bit more strongly. And e-commerce is for sure an area which is going to continue to grow in. We are seeing consumers return to the shops, but it's with some caution. And depending on the country, we're seeing third waves now come in. So we expect that e-commerce is going to continue to be a really a growth area for sales as consumers see that as a safe and reliable way to purchase product. On the inventory side, disruption has a couple of effects there. So COVID hit when we were still in autumn winter 19, and COVID was still around when we were into spring summer 2020 season. So there's brands which have inventory unsold, and some of it could be autumn winter 19, some of it is spring summer 2020. So then the trade-off decision is around, do you hold that inventory until such point as you can sell it again, and then you have the inventory carrying cost and the storage cost, or do you look to sell that product, in which in many cases will require heavy discounting, so you're going to take a hit on margin, but at least that inventory is no longer on the balance sheet. So there's a number of factors impacting inventory there. And then the fourth element of disruption is around logistics and transport. So this is where we've seen this mainly take place across the last 6 months or so, is increasing use of faster flows, and particularly air freight in the early days. When factories in China were closing down, there was a scramble to get product from other countries, to get product into the market. And air was a common way of doing that. Then as demand started to reduce, as stores started to close, there was less of a demand for air freight for finished goods, because there was a lot of product which brands couldn't sell because stores weren't open, or maybe the wholesale partners were not taking those orders because they couldn't sell it either. So there was an increased demand on storage and holding product. But then air freight demand ramped up again as we saw an increasing demand for PPE, and many brands actually purchasing PPE to distribute to their own staff, their own colleagues in stores and in offices. So then there was a requirement again for speed as well. So all of these areas encapsulate how disruption can impact a supply chain. It's all factors of supply chain risk, and supply chain risk is not new. The slide here is giving an overview of various elements of risks, and we can see over on the left there are natural disasters, extreme weather, pandemic, virus, etc. But there's also a number of other risk factors which are very much bubbling right now as well. So trade restrictions as a result of geopolitical tensions, economic risks around price volatility, border delays, currency fluctuations, etc. And then on the technological side, the risks of cybercrime, hacking, etc. All of these risks are still at play. And, I would say we're even seeing an increased level of this type of risk in the last year or so. And supply chain risk for sure is having a higher profile at the board level. So, we're seeing more demand than ever from brands looking at how they can strengthen their supply chains, what they can do, what steps they can take to help reduce the risk and the impact of some of these factors. So let's look at those three main factors that we see as being some of the key ingredients. So number one, flexibility. This slide here shows an overview of a typical supply chain. On the left, you have the sourcing point, which is typically the factories, and that could be, in most cases, that's the finished goods factories, but we also have to think about the raw material before that as well. On the right, you have the demand point, which after the product is in the distribution center, it's going to a store, it's going to a consumer. And in the middle of that, you have the various modes of transportation, crossing various borders that get the product to the end consumer. So why is it important that this needs to be flexible? Well, flexibility is important because the footwear supply chain is no longer the old model of predominantly a wholesale supply chain model for footwear brands. And it's no longer the old model of extended lead times where product was designed, months or year or more in advance, and from the design stage to the product being in store, in some cases now that is down to weeks or months for some types of product. So flexibility is important in the supply chain because it needs to give you as a brand the flexibility to source product wherever makes sense for you, to give you the flexibility to source from multiple locations, not be reliant on just one or two countries. And also on the demand side, it needs to give you the flexibility to fulfill your consumer demand, your customer demand through multiple channels. So e-commerce, we talked about already, a growing sales channel. You need to have a supply chain that can provide the product through that channel and is fulfilling the requirements of the marketplaces, fulfilling the requirements of the consumers when they buy in that channel. Also, the flexibility for you to put your product into new markets. And again, with e-commerce enabling growth in markets without necessarily having to have bricks and mortar stores, that is an important part of the process as well. Pace is also important within the supply chain. So let's talk a little bit about that in the context of speed. So in your supply chain, speed is important because not all of your products need to go through a one-size-fits-all supply chain. For some of your product, maybe it's okay, it's non-seasonal demand. It's almost like a white t-shirt type of product where it's just steady fulfillment throughout the year. But increasingly, what we're seeing within footwear is lots of seasonal launches, lots of micro and capsule collections, limited editions, creating a buzz, creating a demand in different sectors of the market. So speed is important because for some of these lines, it's not good enough just to move it through ocean. It's going to take too long. The customers want it faster than that. And air freight, of course, is the fastest way of moving it, but there's also increasingly other options available now. So, we have options available in the market now around accelerated ocean. The ship is not moving faster on the water, but what is happening, where the speed is happening, is from the point at which the container is taken off the ship to the point at which it gets into the distribution center at the destination market and the container is unloaded. Accelerated ocean could take days out of that process. And those days are important because that's days where you're getting the product quicker to market and you're getting a faster cash to cash cycle time. But there's also intercontinental rail into Europe, which is becoming much more of a well-established mode now. Product can go from China into Europe in 15 days. Also, we're seeing an increasing demand of product coming up from northern Vietnam into China and then going on rail into Europe as well. So rail is becoming a more flexible option and an option from more and more countries out of Asia as well. Then there's also the sea air options, which are in the region typically of 18 to 22 days. Again, it's faster than ocean. It's not as fast as pure air freight, but there's a good cost saving there. So really it's about speed, giving you the option to move those products quicker to the consumers that they just want that product right now. But speed is not always better. Faster is not always better. Sometimes you need to slow product down. We see this at the moment where many brands are stuck with a lot of inventory that they're not able to sell right now. So they don't want that inventory positioned into the market because there's nowhere for them to sell that inventory or nowhere for them to store it. So it's important there that your supply chain is giving you options to hold that product either closer to the source or en route to the market, because if you can hold product in hub ports, for example, whether that's in Asia, the Middle East, or Southern Europe, for example, it enables you to delay the decision about which specific market you position that inventory into. So you don't need to bring it all the way into Germany or Spain or the US. You can hold it en route, and then you can decide where to send that product to when you have the demand signal from the market, when the stores are open, etc. So speed is important, but also going slow sometimes is important. And this is the type of flexibility that you need in those scenarios. Okay. Component number 3 is resilience. So resilience really is about the ability of your supply chain to take a shock, and the ability to bounce back from the shock. It's the ability of your supply chain to kind of get back on its feet very quickly and get up back to speed and deal with that impact that's happening. So in our experience, there's a couple of elements to that. On the left of the slide here, you have elements of business continuity. On the right of the slide, you have elements of supply chain design. So if we look at the left side of the slide, business continuity, a lot of these are actions which you take when you're in the crisis. The crisis is happening. And these are all important because a lot of the time the crisis is out of your control. It's something that you've not been able to plan specifically for. But having things like a global task force which can immediately come together and get a view across what's happening in the supply chain. So that task force is made up of people that are across the key parts of your supply chain. So your sourcing locations, your markets, your head office. And it's a task force that's having a view on that flow throughout the chain. So where is your inventory today? Where is that inventory sitting? What inventory is en route to the final market? What orders have you got with factories right now? What orders are coming through from factories in the coming days and weeks? And where are the issues in your supply chain? Where are the shortages of product? It's important that this task force is able to get a view of that, and that they're communicating proactively with the relevant people within the brand, the business, the various stakeholders, your customers, your suppliers as well. And then once you have that visibility of the flow and where product is and where some of the holdups are, it's then about making very quick operational decisions about where to slow down, where to speed up, looking at if you've got certain factories or countries which are closing, where do you then need to switch on supply from elsewhere? And then also on here is around best practice sharing. So it's important that your partners in the supply chain are sharing best practice and giving you insight into what is working elsewhere, what are some of the other companies doing, even in other sectors, which you could also do in your supply chain. So those things are all important, but you can't just do that on your own. So you also on its own. So what is also important is the stuff here on the right of this slide, and this is really where a lot of opportunity is now for brands coming through COVID, looking at where have we got some blind spots around our supply chain that we need to address now, so that the next time something disrupts us, whether it's the COVID, whether it's geopolitical, we're in a better position to withstand that. So supply chain design covers a number of things. There's a lot of people in this webinar who are very well versed in this, but some of the key things is looking at where are some of the risk factors in your supply chain. So on the sourcing side, what would happen if your main leather supplier was to shut down because of a virus? What would happen if your supplier of the different components of the soles of your footwear, are you relying on one or two suppliers for that? Are they all in one country? Or do you have a more diversified supply chain of those raw materials? Also looking at for the where your finished goods are manufactured, where is that happening? Is that all concentrated in one province of one country, or do you have that spread out? So if a country was essentially shut down due to a virus, are you able to source from elsewhere, or are you just going to have to sit and wait until that country opens up again? And in the meantime, you're going to lose out on sales. So, it's about looking at a lot of these scenarios, and then looking at how the supply chain can flex and be designed to enable you to diversify your sourcing across different areas, and also using things like regional distribution if you don't want to rely on specific end markets, as an example. But the good thing is, and this is where technology is helping a lot, is that there's a lot of software and technology now which can help with this type of scenario planning. So you're able to model risk and disruption in a simulated environment without it hitting you in real life. Okay, so those are some of the ingredients that we've talked about in terms of building a resilient supply chain. I want to talk a little bit now about some of the mid to long-term impacts that we see. And this is coming on the back of COVID to an extent, but it's also part of some of the general factors we're seeing happening in the industry. So absolutely, e-commerce is a growing factor within the footwear supply chain, and it will continue to be so. Consumers, have embraced e-commerce. It's seen as a relatively safe way of shopping. It's reliable, it's quick, and then for the brands, it's also a way of building a direct relationship with the end consumer, and it takes away reliance on, for example, a wholesale channel where you don't have that link with the end consumer. So for sure, e-commerce growth is here to stay. Also in the middle here, we see multi-sourcing. So this is really about mitigating risks of, if there's a problem in one country, that you're able to then switch sourcing to somewhere else. The old adage of not putting all your eggs in one basket applies here. And, from a sourcing overview, China is still very much the largest in footwear overall, but we see a continued growth in countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, India, Turkey, and other countries as well emerging. So this is here to stay, and now with the added advantage of reducing risk because it doesn't expose you just to one market. Then supply chain optimization on the right. This is something which has higher focus from board level these days. Optimizing supply chain is about mitigating risks and putting in place risk mitigation measures. It's about diversifying sourcing, etc. But it can also be about looking at your wider supply chain. So we've seen an increased interest from brands looking to get more visibility and control of their upstream raw material supply chain. And that a lot is because during COVID, we've seen instances where brands were not able to really have an idea of how they could fulfill their consumer demand, because they didn't have a view of the raw materials supply chain, and they had factories which were not able to produce because they couldn't get the raw materials. But because the brand didn't have visibility of the raw materials flow, it meant it was very difficult for them to make any sort of commitments and manage the expectations of their commercial and sales departments, because they were relying on their factories to get the raw materials. And because Chinese factories were closed, even factories manufacturing product in places like Vietnam, India, Africa, if a lot of the raw materials are coming from China and China's closed, then the factory in Vietnam or India or Africa, at some point that has to stop producing as well, because they can't get the raw materials. So this is also an area of supply chain optimization that we're seeing more interest in. Okay, so flexibility, speed, resilience, those are the three main ingredients that we're seeing. On flexibility, it's about the reach of the supply chain, geographical flexibility as well as pace. Speed, that's about going fast when you need to, but also being able to slow down and hold inventory closer to the source before routing it into the final markets. And resilience, that's about resilience, planning resilience into the supply chain and running those simulations around supply chain risk. But it's also resilience in the moment when the crisis hits, being able to take that blow and then bounce back from it and come out successful. So I hope you find that useful. In Maersk, we're working with a lot of brands across the footwear industry. We'd love to talk to you about your brands. If you have any further questions or you'd like to discuss some of the topics that I've covered today, very keen to connect. If you have any questions right now, I would be happy to take them. So thank you again. Okay, so the question from Peter Tan. With the current digitalization trend, how do you see the adoption of digital supply chain in the region, in the footwear industry? What would be the biggest challenge if manufacturing would be to explore this approach? So where I see digitalization coming in more around the footwear industry, blockchain. So I think blockchain has the opportunity to really switch on the light across the wider supply chain. So many footwear brands right now have visibility from when the footwear is manufactured until it gets to their distribution center, or they hand it over to the wholesaler, or they deliver that product to a consumer if they're handling that channel. But visibility of what happens before that, so in the raw material space, is not really there in many cases. Blockchain has a potential to really help with that. Blockchain can help with sustainability, because you can track, is the leather that you're using in the footwear, is it coming from the right sustainable and certified sources? Are the dyes that are being used in the materials, are they coming from accredited sources? It gives that level of visibility, but also it gives the visibility of, because it gives visibility before the production process, you can also then use that in your sales and operations planning to then look at how you're going to fulfill demand and how long it's going to take product to get to market. And blockchain enables you as a brand to pull together, you could be using various visibility systems within your supply chain right now across different providers. Blockchain is a way of bringing that all together and linking that together. What do I think will be the biggest challenge? I think that's a good question. I think I think the biggest challenge would be inertia and not taking this opportunity that we have right now to take the learnings from COVID particularly, and to take those learnings on board and design those more effective supply chains of the future. And I think another challenge is, you know, if brands or companies are not actively seeking out practices from around the industry or different industries to help them mitigate risk and use digitalization, I think that's also a challenge as well, because there's a lot of, you know, great practice out there and knowledge. So it's about being open to that, and then you know, picking out what works for your particular brand. So how soon do we expect blockchain to be adopted in footwear industry, particularly raw material in China and other countries? Good question. Thank you, Chris. So speaking from a Maersk point of view, we're already seeing some trials in blockchain in the wider apparel industry. So particularly denim wear as one example. So, you know, the technology is there, it's working. Trials are happening. I've not personally seen a trial yet within the footwear industry, but the capability is there to do that. So, you know, I hope that we start to see some of those trials happening this year, actually. Okay, question from Helen. Supply chain resilience. Some countries may have a tech limitation to provide multi-type material, or don't have multi-choice to find suitable vendor. What's your suggestion for this? I guess if I understand that correctly, Helen, is that a question around if there's certain materials where you can only source in one country, or there's certain products that you can only get in one country? Yeah, that's a good question, because then, you know, that brings risks into play where you're reliant on that country for that. I mean, offhand, some of the, you know, the thoughts are there is, you know, is that something where maybe you need to build up some safety stock of that material outside of that country, for example, if you then, you know, if that country is in a shutdown mode? Or, you know, is it a case of working with suppliers in those countries to start up manufacturing in other countries? Maybe that could be an option. You know, we've seen as apparel and footwear manufacturing has grown outside of China into, you know, parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, that a lot of those manufacturers started manufacturing in China, and now they're moving into other markets. So, you know, that could be one option. But I'd also be interested to hear if there's other brands or people in the audience that have had that challenge, and whether they've found a good way to address that. Thank you, Helen.